Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this second session of the Australasian Public Library Conference. I'm Simon Wakeling. I'm an academic at CSU, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's session. So the topic of this session is public library collection development and management. I'll begin by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands I'm based on here in Bathurst, New South Wales. We have three speakers to hear from this afternoon. We're going to start off with Associate Professor Jane Garner, who's going to talk about the value of first language reading for migrant communities. After that, it'll be Professor Anne Goulding from Victoria University of Wellington, talking about contemporary collection practices in New Zealand. And finally, Ellen Forsyth from the State Library of New South Wales, talking about local studies collections in public libraries. So the session will be recorded. We'll be sharing a recording with all people registered for the conference later in the week. Each presentation will be about 20-25 minutes, and then there'll be 5 or 10 minutes after that for questions and discussion. So feel free to put any questions you have in the chat as you go, and I'll collate those and we can address them to the speakers at the end. So the first speaker then is Associate Professor Jane Garner, and her presentation is titled More Than Words, the Emotional and Cultural Value of First Language Reading for Migrant Communities in Australia. And Jane's a colleague of mine in the School of Information and Communication Studies at Charles Sturt University. And she researches the roles of reading, libraries and information in closed, restricted and marginalised communities, including people living in prisons and people experiencing homelessness and other forms of poverty and disadvantage. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Simon. I'm going to share my screen now. Does that look as it should? Perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today I'm sharing some findings from a research project that explores how first language reading supports migrant communities in Australia and the role that public libraries play in this. This project was funded very kindly by the State Library of New South Wales and was recently published in the journal called Public Library Quarterly earlier this year, if you wanted to check out some more information about it. But firstly, I want to acknowledge that I live and work in Naarm or Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise them as the traditional owners of this beautiful place that I get to live and work. That's the Yarra River in Abbotsford, which is about a 2-minute walk from my house, which is just a most wonderful privilege to live near. So, as I mentioned, this presentation reports on a piece of research that I undertook with the help of the State Library of New South Wales that looked at the role of first language reading in migrant communities in Australia and how public libraries were contributing to those practices. Australia is one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world. We have more than 8 million residents who were born overseas. Over 23% of households speak a language other than English at home. Public libraries serve these communities every day. Pardon me. Understanding the importance of first language reading is essential to provide inclusive and meaningful library services. According to the existing literature on the topic, reading in a first language fosters emotional well-being, maintains cultural identity, and supports family connections. In previous studies, people who have migrated to a new country and language often find it comforting and often find comfort and belonging through first language reading. This has implications, of course, for how we design and promote library collections in languages other than English. Libraries have collected things in languages other than English for a very long time. Beyond the role of giving people something to read, the symbolic role of these collections matters just as much. By providing these collections, libraries signal that diverse languages and cultures are welcome and valued. This helps people feel seen, supported, and included in their new homes. And I should say all the photos that are in this presentation are ones that I've taken in libraries around Australia of their foreign language collections. The study that I'm talking about today aimed to understand migrant readers' experiences and the role of public libraries in that experience. The 4 research questions guided the inquiry. I wanted to understand more about what the experience of reading in a first language was like for people who have migrated. I wanted to know where they were accessing readings in their first language at the moment. Were they aware of library collections in their first language? And if so, were there any barriers to them accessing these collections? Participants were selected with the help of the wonderful staff at the State Library of New South Wales, in particular, Oriana Acevedo, who I understand has since retired. So my thanks go to her. We had readers from 11 languages, specifically Arabic, Bangla, Bulgarian, Cantonese, Korean, Mandarin, Persian, Polish, Russian, Spanish, and Tamil. I conducted semi-structured interviews online through Zoom with the 12 participants and created a transcript of each interview for analysis. I used a thematic approach to draw out the shared experiences of what these people were telling me. These interviews took place during one of the big COVID lockdowns. So this data is from, a couple of years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago now. And it was a wonderful experience to sit down with these people who were all locked into our houses and talk about the value of reading in first language. It was a great privilege. So the things that I found about what first language reading is like, so the experience of reading in a first language, these 4 themes came out quite strongly, that it was an emotional experience, a cultural experience, a relaxing and relieving experience, and a welcoming experience. So I'll go through these very briefly through the next couple of slides. So firstly, the emotional experience. Participants used really powerful and emotive language when talking about reading in their first language. Reading in their own language was described as being like oxygen or mother's milk were terms that came up a lot. The word oxygen kept coming up a lot. It was like it was a life-giving activity for them. One man described feeling like he was a child again, sitting on his mother's knee and feeling perfectly at home in a way that was no longer accessible to him through any other means. So it was very an emotional experience for people being able to read in a first language. It took them right back to their first homes. Many participants described first language reading as critical to their sense of self as a person who had a cultural heritage or a cultural past that was no longer present in their current the current country. Many also described it as a way to maintain their heritage and share it with their children through reading them stories in their heritage language. They talked about first language reading as being in the centre of going backwards in time to their own past and be able to connect them back to their own past, but also a bridge into the future where they could use first language reading with their children to connect their children back to their heritage culture. And they saw the reading in first language is really central to being able to bridge both the past and the future with their cultural heritage. In terms of being relaxing and welcoming, they said that reading in English requires a lot of effort. Even if they can speak quite fluent English or read it quite easily, it still requires a lot more effort and sort of mental work when they're reading in English compared to their first language. First language reading offered ease and a full engagement with the text rather than trying to nut it out as they read through it. It was just soaked through as it does for us when we read English. Participants also viewed multilingual collections in libraries as a sign that their cultures were respected and valued in their new countries. Seeing books in the library in their first languages made them feel that they had a place in their community, and it gave them a sense of belonging. In answer to the question about where people are finding first language reading, many readers rely on a mix of sources. While libraries are a resource, Many participants also self-source materials through community networks or by bringing them in from overseas. And it should be noted that the 12 people I spoke to were found for me by the State Library of New South Wales. So they already did have a connection to a library. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been given to me as the participants. So if I'd spoken to 12 other people from those language groups, it was possible that they may not have used the libraries at all, but the ones that I spoke to did. And that's how I found them in the first place. The idea of these community sharing was really interesting and very strong outcome. Almost every participant talked about sharing within their own cultural community of books and readings and magazines and that sort of thing. One story that really stood out was a fellow who spoke Bangla, and he said that he had no luck finding books in his own language outside his own collection, and people in his own cultural community were saying the same thing. And so what they ended up doing was that they pulled all their books and magazines that they had in their own language, and they put them into the local ethnic grocer, which was selling food that they like to cook from their own sort of cultural heritage as well. And the greengrocer or the grocer gave them a shelf in his shop and said, yep, you can put all your things in there. And all the people were coming into that shop anyway to buy food to cook. And while they bought their food, they also went and borrowed a book from the library that was sitting in the grocery and brought it back and swapped them over. And they used this sort of informal space to share their collections because they were having trouble finding them anywhere else. Often also people would invite others into their homes because they might maintain a library in their own language. This was particularly true of the person I spoke to who spoke Persian. He had his own collection in his house, and he invited members of his own community in to read the books in their language. About whether they were using libraries or not to access first language materials, as I said, the people I spoke to were people who were connected to the State Library of New South Wales in some way, so they obviously used libraries a bit. And most participants knew about the multilingual library collections that libraries do provide, but they often found them really hard to access, and there was a number of reasons for that. Sometimes the collections aren't all out on the shelf, and so they were reliant on catalogues to try and identify what was available. And often the catalogue searches were not easy for them because they were all in English in most cases. The catalogues themselves are in English, so they preferred to browse the shelves, but of course not all the collections were out available on the shelf, so browsing was quite limited in its success rate for them. Also, in non-Roman script languages, the catalogues are sort of like transliterated. So the sounds of what those words are put into English characters, and to search for them is really hard because the people who want to read in non-Roman script had to try and guess how those words might have been transliterated into English characters or into Roman characters. And often that was not done as they would have done it themselves. So they found it really hard to search in Roman characters for something in, say, a Russian script. So that catalogues were quite sort of a bit of a barrier for them there. And often some of the collections were really outdated. It was a recognition there that buying material in languages other than English is really expensive and quite hard to do, and there's not a great availability of some languages. So that's reflected in the sort of collections that are available through public libraries. And often people were saying that they're really busy, and when they come to a new country, they are establishing themselves and they work really hard. They might have multiple jobs, not a lot of time to sort of go to a public library and catch a bus. They might take an hour there, an hour back. And it's something that was really hard for them to use the library for. They found much more success in those sort of local network sharing amongst each other. So what's getting in the way? Barriers were both practical and systemic. Promotion was limited. Some people weren't aware of all the different options that they had available to them in second language or first language reading collections. They didn't always reflect current demand. Some participants, as I said, struggled physically to reach the libraries with suitable materials, and the collections were often not what they would have chosen to read themselves. Sometimes people were saying what they really wanted to do was to borrow a book in their own language and the same book in English, and they would use that as a way of learning English. They'd, read them in tandem and be able to pick up new words from their own language and see how they're written in English and follow the story along both ways as a way of learning English. And that wasn't always possible to do, to be able to get the same book in both languages. So what could help? Participants had some really thoughtful suggestions, and almost all of them included a better use of themselves as an ambassador for the library. So what they were saying is, put me between the library and my community, and I will bring my community in, and I will help the library to do a better job in promoting the collections to the community. There was a strong appetite for a deeper engagement with the library. They were offering to do things like curate the content, help the library with its purchasing. They were saying things like, I can do cultural programming and we'll have an event based around our culture. I'll bring people in, we'll celebrate, we'll have our food, and you can put the collections out and show the community what you've got. Just sort of ways of bringing people into the library using like what they called them language ambassadors. They wanted shelf notes that had book reviews in their own language sitting on the shelf with the foreign language collections, rather than just having them tucked away into boxes or just on the shelf. They wanted more relevant, diverse and up-to-date collections. And they also wanted to be able to digitize their own content and make that available to each other. So things like oral histories and storytelling in their own language, captured through audio and video and shared amongst the other people in their communities. So what can libraries do? This work needs to be quite intentional. We could benefit from some co-design with community members to promote the collections and to invest in discoverability. So in particular, they were saying the transliteration is a real problem for the catalogues that are in English, but our language doesn't use the same script. If you want, I will sit down with the library staff and help you recatalogue books that have been transliterated so that they more accurately represent what people might actually search for. They would like signage in their own language as well as in English, and they would like further promotion of the collections. The most strong message that kept coming out was that they really want to work with the libraries. They really want to be building partnerships with the libraries and the cultural groups to be able to encourage more first language reading and to make it a more satisfying experience for the readers. So in conclusion, libraries are uniquely positioned to support migrant communities through this really important activity of first language reading. This is a highly valued service to migrant communities that not only provides them with reading in their first language, but also acts as evidence of welcome in their new country. It provides them with a link back to their old homes and a way to support their children's access to their cultural heritage. There are opportunities for public libraries to engage more purposefully with migrant communities that would allow stronger ties and improved services to these groups. And it's something that is so highly valued that it's really worth investing time and effort into if we can. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting.
Thanks very much, Jane. That was excellent as always. Do we have any questions? I can't see anything in the chat so far, but if you want to ask anything of Jane, feel free to type it in.
That was easy.
No, I've got a question. Are there any services, are there any libraries doing anything particular that you're aware of in this space that's particularly interesting or worth knowing about in terms of how they're either publicizing or delivering this kind of content?
not that I've really noticed as being sort of, beyond outstanding. Well, like the State Library of New South Wales has this fantastic service where they allow people to order things and it gets delivered to them. But again, there's some constraints on usability of catalogues and not being able to browse and that sort of thing. That's an element of that. Don't know really. Maybe someone here's got an example of what their library's doing that is supporting first language reading.
There we go.
It's Selector of World Languages for Wellington. Oh, nice. Great. Oh, I'm glad that's useful for you. Thank you.
Someone who's read your article, Jane.
There you go. That was worth the effort. Thank you.
There's a question from Kylie. Have you got any examples of libraries successfully utilising community language liaisons?
Yes, Ali Southwell does it well. She invites Chinese community to choose items for the collection. So that's great. The article was published in Public Library Quarterly. Yeah, look, I think all libraries do it a bit. Like I was at the Broome Public Library and they've got a fantastic collection there of community languages in their group. And I think I know within Indigenous languages, they were having Indigenous people coming in and doing Indigenous story times and teaching local kids Indigenous words for things that they encounter every day. So although that's not a foreign language, it's a way to engage with language that is through the reading materials. So yeah, I'm sure there's lots of great stuff going on. Yeah, Alicia's got a good idea there of suggestions from other people about what they do. So if you've got any ideas about what your library is doing to support first language reading or to encourage its use of the collections that you do have, pop them in the chat and we'll all learn from each other.
And maybe Jane, you could put a link to that article in the chat
yes,
at some point in the next half an hour or so.
Yeah.
All right. Final call for any last questions, or we can say thank you very much, Jane. Okay, so let's move on to our second presentation, and this is from Professor Anne Goulding, and the title of this presentation is Local Realities, Global Pressures, Contemporary Collection Practices in Aotearoa Libraries. Anne is Professor of Library and Information Management at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. She's Programme Director for the Information Studies Programme in the School of Information Management. Research interests lie primarily in the area of management of library and information services, and she has a particular interest in how library and information services demonstrate the impact of their programs and services. Anne is currently leading projects investigating collection management practices in libraries, including the management of open education resources. So over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Simon. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. It's lovely to join you. Very pleased to be here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the conference is being hosted, and also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present. So today I'm going to be talking about some results from a research project that I've been involved with around collection management, and I think it follows on very nicely. Some of the things I'll be discussing follows on very nicely from both Jane's talk and some of the talks this morning as well, so I'll be picking up on those as we go along. This research project actually covered all types of libraries, but I'm going to focus on the results from public libraries specifically today for obvious reasons, in keeping with the conference theme. So let's talk a little bit about collection. So I'm being very careful with my volume control here because I think I turned my mic off earlier accidentally. So I'm trying to I might be a little bit fiddly around the edges here. Okay, so yeah, so just thinking about the talk this morning from Celine Schloeffel-Armstrong, and her discussion of the library as social infrastructure. And of course, we all know that libraries are about so much more than books. Yeah, I mean, we now see them as community hubs, as community anchors, as social spaces, places for people to go. So yeah, libraries are not just about books, although I haven't read Celine's work actually in depth, but you know, there is the public perception, and she talked about that tension, and I might mention it a little bit more later. But in the eyes of many of our patrons, our users, our communities, libraries are places that you go to get books. And I think the perspective of the libraryness is related very often to books. However, although we recognize now that libraries are about more than just books, collections do, I think, still remain at the heart of library services internationally, as well as here in Aotearoa. And whether those collections are physical or digital or electronic, a lot of the work of libraries and librarians is around collections, acquiring collections, arranging collections, making those collections accessible. And of course, we know that librarians' approaches to their collection work is guided very much by the needs of the users, yeah, the needs of the patrons and the communities. So I think context, when we're thinking about collections in public libraries, context is absolutely crucial there and absolutely central, and determines and shapes, I suppose, what materials are acquired and retained and made accessible. So in Aotearoa, specifically, if we're talking about context, we have quite a specific socioeconomic context, and of course a bicultural context, and that plays a large role, a significant role in collection practices in libraries here in Aotearoa. And I think, you know, my colleague Spencer Lilly this morning gave an overview of some of the key aspects of that work in his talk. But just to build on that, in their work with collections, libraries in Aotearoa navigates, you know, some quite complex issues around biculturalism, decolonization, indigenization, and serving diverse communities on a daily basis. So very focused on the context here of their particular communities and the country more generally. But of course, we also know that there are global trends impacting on collection management and development. So in this talk, that's the kind of duality I'm going to be talking about. So talking about some of those contextual factors and their impact on collection management and practice in public libraries in Aotearoa, but also thinking about that global aspect as well, and the impact that might have. So a little bit about the research, first of all. This was envisaged, it was envisaged as a kind of scoping study. Really, my thoughts were, what's on librarians' minds about their collections? Yeah, so as I say, you know, there has been this focus on the library building and as a community hub, and yet a lot of the librarians' work is around collections. And I just thought, do we talk about collections so much anymore? I'd like to know more about what people are thinking about their collections. So that was my that wasn't the research question, but that was the question that was in my mind when I approached this research. It was a scoping study trying to, I think, identify those aspects in librarians' work with their collections that might then lead on to further work and more in-depth work. So it was an interview-based study. So these are quite preliminary findings, really, and we used a mix of kind of purposive and snowball sampling. And as I say, it did cover lots of different types of libraries. So, I'd say I want to talk to a law librarian, and I know this law librarian, or I know somebody who knows them. I've got their contact. So it was kind of purposive on the one hand, and also snowball as well. So I'd say, do you know anybody else who's interested in these issues? Who could I talk to about this aspect in particular, etc. The interviews were unstructured, and I didn't have an interview schedule as such, or an interview protocol, but I had a list of kind of topics and issues that I had, or that we had, so I had a couple of research assistants working with me, that we had identified from the literature. So we did a big literature review and said, okay, so these are the things that are coming up. These are the topics that people seem to be talking about. So we had this long list of topics that I sent in advance to the librarians and said, these are the sort of things we think are interesting, like your views on these, which of these are most important to you. There may be others, feel free to bring up anything else. So that was the approach, and actually it worked really well. We had long and meandering conversations, which was really interesting as well. So we did over 20 interviews. Some of them were with more than one person. And as I say, not all were public libraries, but that was the largest number in type. The highest proportion of interviewees were public librarians. So let me talk a little bit about some of the findings. So I think Jane had 4 themes, and I've got 4 themes as well. So we talked, these were the things that kind of stood out to us that was perhaps a little bit different in Aotearoa, or perhaps had, not different, but had an Aotearoa flavor to them. So collection diversity, book challenges, space, which again links with Celine's talk this morning, and the ever-present budgetary issues, of course. So I'll talk through each of those in turn. So first of all, collection diversity, and there's a range of issues, a range of key issues that came up here. First of all, there were the approaches to collection diversity, and here maybe picking up on some things that Jane raised, thinking about collection diversity and trying to increase the diversity of the collection to meet the needs of different users within the community, different patrons. Overall, collection diversity was a really high priority, and that was actually across all the different types of libraries. But we're talking about public libraries here. So the librarians were really passionate about trying to ensure that their collections reflected and represented their communities, meeting the needs of diverse people within their communities. And that idea about enabling people to see themselves in the collections. So most, if not all of them, I think, talked about how their libraries were establishing or enriching their Maori and Pacifica collections to meet community needs. And again, picking up on some things that Jane was saying there, really trying to strengthen the cultural and linguistic identity of their patrons. And that whole Bishop's, we've heard it a lot, haven't we? Bishop's concepts of doors, windows, and mirrors. A lot of them were familiar with that concept, and that was mentioned more than once, especially in relation to children's materials. And public librarians also talked about their fulfilling their obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the nation's founding document. And for them, that meant prioritizing Te Reo Maori materials, so Maori language materials, recognizing Mataranga Maori in the way in which collections were organized and accessed, and also that consultation and engagement with Maori communities and groups on collections and item management. That can be a little bit tricky. We might come back to that as well. And I don't know if anybody's seen, I saw we had a participant here from Wellington City Library, so kia ora. And, you might have seen this recently as well. So that this is our replacement central library at the moment. Our central library is closed for refurbishment, earthquake strengthening, opening next year. This is they're trialing a new way to organize Mataranga Maori literature in a way that they hope will be meaningful to Maori. Yeah, so we all know the arguments about Dewey and its Western perspective, and so this is a way of trying to make that more accessible. Some libraries are also trying to support targeted procurement of local and indigenous materials and arrange it in ways that are meaningful for people. But people also, our interviewees also talked about the difficulties they faced in doing this. And here's one of these global pressures, I think. The limited range of resources available, the difficulty of acquiring, again, as Jane was saying, the difficulty of acquiring indigenous and diverse materials, because of the dynamics of the international publishing industry. But it's also closer to home, as you can see here. A quote there from one of my participants. The book industry, it's getting better, but it just hasn't caught up to who we're catering for. It's still very white. And with a population of just over 5 million, we don't have the economies of scale here that, larger nations enjoy in relation to library acquisitions. The majority of our books are imported. That can significantly increase prices, and even locally published materials often costs more because of the small print runs. Yeah, we haven't, the publishing industry here is quite small and limited. So the publication of Maori, and actually particularly Pacifica materials, is quite limited. And in fact, we're going to talk about budget in a little while, but even those libraries who said, actually, our budget's okay. And we did have librarians saying that. Not everybody is completely cash strapped. And I think public libraries often put quite a lot of resource into Maori and Pacific materials, but often they can't spend it all just because of the lack of availability. And say Pacifica materials particularly seem to be a little bit of an issue there. There's not the quality, there's not the range of material that they would like. Some have found a way around this. So we have Auckland libraries. They've established actually a publishing program to create and publish Maori and Pacifica materials. Very often engaging with the community as well and drawing from the community on the creativity of the community. But Auckland's city libraries is a big library system. It is the biggest library system in Australasia. So, you know, they have the resources, they have the capacity to do that. And of course, many other libraries do not. And in fact, people did say that things were improving, but it can still be an issue. The other challenge to increasing the diversity is staff capability. And some interviewees talked about the need for diverse teams and staff with relevant cultural competence. Again, picking up on some of Jane's points there, and actually not just in relation to Maori and Pacifica materials, but also, again, like Australia, Aotearoa is a multicultural society, and increasingly so. And so there was this need to recruit, especially from our South Asian communities. And that was mentioned as an example. So again, this need for good connections into the communities was mentioned as very important. You know, identifying people who can contribute to the library. There was, you know, some people mentioned setting up internships, for example, special projects which could introduce potential employees into the library. Okay, next theme then, book challenges. Okay, so this was one of the most discussed topics. I think it's on a lot of people's minds, and that's probably why. And certainly this is a global issue. But again, it also has a particular local flavor here in Aotearoa. So many libraries hold items, well, all libraries really hold items on Maori people, Maori culture, and te tiriti, and often those materials are out of date or in some cases just plain wrong. And the library, and sometimes they get challenged on that. Yeah, so they get challenges in that respect. And the libraries had a range of way of dealing with that. Some felt that it was important to keep them on the shelves for those actually researching those perspectives. Yeah. Others removed factually incorrect materials. Others added notes to the catalogue. Yeah. Others restricted the items. The other aspect about this is that self-published items are becoming a particular issue, and people gifting, kindly gifting their self-published volumes to the library. A particular case that we've had here in Aotearoa, it's not really self-published because they have set themselves up as a publisher. It's called Tross Publishing, and it's a small publishing house, and it's focused specifically on Maori issues, but from a particular perspective. I'm sure you can you understand what I'm talking about. And they have been campaigning really strongly to have their books included in library collections, in public libraries and in school libraries in particular. And many libraries have decided not to include them or have them put them in the stacks or have removed them altogether. But that's quite an interesting case if you want to have a look at that. That's Tross Publishing. The other main area of stock discussed when considering book challenges is LGBTQI or Q+ materials. And again, like other libraries around the world, there have been protests and disruptions around rainbow events held in the libraries, as well as challenges to, you know, book displays, rainbow book displays, etc. One librarian, now the amount of challenges actually is not that great, although we haven't had a way of tracking it until very recently. So just recently, Lianza has set up a book challenge register where librarians can report challenges. But before that, we didn't really have a very good idea of what's going on. Anecdotally, we'd heard about things, but so hopefully that register will give us more information about that. But my impression from this is that it doesn't happen that often, but people were quite even if they don't challenge it outright and directly, there were other things going on. So one librarian, for example, and this told me about a patron who goes around the library's youth section. She's an adult, but she's in the library's youth section, and she puts notes in the books that she considers inappropriate. And those are usually in relation to trans issues. So the librarian said they had a pretty good idea about who it was, but they had not yet caught them in the act, and so they were waiting to pounce, I think. Yeah. But as I say, overall, censorship book challenges in New Zealand are on the modest side, but there is this impression that they're on the rise. That picture, by the way, you might have seen it. It was a group led by somebody called Brian Tamaki, and this was a protest about a I think it was a drag king, actually. I don't think it was a drag queen. I think it might have been a drag king in an Auckland library, and they just disrupted it. And it was, injured people in the process as well. So we are aware of it, I think. So I think the international picture has enabled librarians here in Aotearoa to be quite forward looking about the situation and to pay attention to what can be done. And you can see there lots of sympathy with Australian colleagues. I realise I'm running out of time, so I will press on. Let's talk about space then. And again, back to the talk by Celine this morning. Space was considered a huge challenge for public library collection management. This positioning of the library as a multi-functioning community hub has led to that tension and maybe competition for the use of space for book collections and other uses. And also this, our modern ideas about shelving, having lower shelving, having less shelving, making the space a much more open and accessible area. That's also led to fewer books on the shelves as well. The academic librarians I talked to stressed that they now had an e-first policy. So about 90% of their acquisitions are now electronic. Yeah, very different for public libraries, of course. So what can we do about that? Weeding and deselection is, of course, part of being a librarian, is part of keeping a healthy collection. Look, the librarian said they did use this as quite a quick and easy way to relieve space pressures and to make the collections more usable as well, as I was saying. Some people said that their colleagues were reluctant to do it. They loved having the books on the shelves, and some librarians apparently do find it quite difficult to get rid of books, and there is this issue about the public reaction, especially with large-scale weeding projects. And we have had a few high-profile cases here in Aotearoa, and just recently, you can see this is the 12th of June, book dealer sickened by plan to destroy 500,000. And there was another, actually, it was before this, when the National Library it's the National Library, they were talking about deselection, and there was a whole article in the Guardian newspaper about, I see it and I weep, so it's a very, sorry, I'm making fun, and that's not fair, because it is an emotional issue. Yeah, people are very attached, and it is an emotional issue. And I think the librarians acknowledge this and just feel we have to be clear in our communication. We have to be more transparent about what we're doing and why we're doing it. As a result, many have adopted more transparent weeding policies and guidelines, and have much stronger and more positive consultation with stakeholders, and also more sustainable ways of disposing of materials. A real emphasis on, donating, giving books away, selling them, rather than just pulping. Finally, then, budget. I've talked a little bit about the budget already in terms of the publishing industry. And no doubt all libraries would like to have more money to spend on resources. But actually, as I said, quite a few of our interviewees said, well, actually, our budgets are quite reasonable. That could just be the people I talked to, and certainly some librarians said, no, we don't have enough money. So, it wasn't common across the board. And I think, again, there are some challenges specific to Aotearoa. Our weak Kiwi dollar has caused real issues with the international exchange rate. And as I say, particularly as most resources are sourced from overseas. And post-COVID, I think prices were kept low over COVID, but now they are ramping up again. So there's a bit of an issue with that. One thing that was stressed when talking about budgetary pressures was the benefits of collaboration and consortia. Yeah, and that's undoubtedly an effective measure. Lots of interviewees mentioned library consortia and regional consortia in particular. So here in the Lower North Island, for example, we have the SMART Consortium, different library services in Wellington and up the coast and a bit further north, cooperating on purchasing both print and electronic resources. And that helps, reduce procurement costs. So there is quite an emphasis on that. Right, I am going to finish there because I've probably taken more time than I should have. But I hope that's given you a bit of an idea about what's on librarians' minds, our public librarians in Aotearoa. I'm sure it probably aligns with your experiences in Australia and probably internationally as well. But as I say, I think in Aotearoa, we do have these more complex issues around biculturalism, decolonization, serving diverse communities on a daily basis, while also trying to negotiate some of these global trends as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was fascinating. It's great. It sounds like an incredibly comprehensive project, and there's a fair bit more to come, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. I'm actually at Rails. Little advert for Rails. We're going to be presenting a little bit more in depth on the weeding issue. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, we've already had a couple of questions in the chat there. So the first one is, do New Zealand school and public libraries support each other?
Not so much, actually. I did ask a couple of people about this, and I remember saying somebody who was part of a public library consortium, for example, saying, have you thought about reaching out to the schools? They said, oh, yeah, that might be a good idea. Like it hadn't agreed. What we do have, though, in Aotearoa is that we have the National Library, which has responsibilities extending to other library sectors. So the National Library has a services to schools department, facility, whatever you want to call it, and that the school librarians I talked to were absolutely said we would not survive without the National Library services to schools. So it's they send out collections of books to the libraries for use in the library or in the curriculum, and then the libraries have to send it back. And there's all these, different postal rates, and so they make it as easy as possible for school libraries. Yeah.
Well, thanks. And a question from Cynthia: How do you balance the different needs of communities using a consortia model? I guess diverse demographics.
I'm not sure how they do it, but that is certainly a question. I don't know. I'm just thinking about the SMART consortium. Actually, there's probably somebody from Wellington here who would be able to answer this better than I can. But there are different communities, and Yeah, I think they do a lot of discussing. So for example, here in Wellington, we have some, fairly middle class, wealthy communities, and just up the road, there are communities that are very heavily Pacifica, for example. So yeah, that's an interesting question. That would be a good research project.
Very good. Okay, so that looked like the last question. I think we better move on to the last presentation now, Anne. So thank you so much for that. Really interesting. And yeah, we look forward to hearing more at Rails.
Kia ora.
Okay, so our last presentation for this session is by Ellen Forsyth, and the title is Collecting Opportunities, Local Studies Collections in Public Libraries. So Ellen is a consultant at public library services at the State Library of New South Wales. Ellen's interested in how public libraries manage collecting current materials for local studies and has experience with collaborative projects. Her work involves providing advice to public libraries, reviewing their services, and in coordinating statewide working groups for local studies, readers advisory, and reference and information services. Ellen's PhD is about local studies collections in public libraries. So over to you, Ellen.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone, this afternoon. I would like to acknowledge that I am on the land of the people of the Gadi, who are part of the Aotearoa Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. The knowledge sharing practices and importance of place for Aboriginal people are critical for local studies collections in public libraries too. Local studies collections are a vital way to document as well as to research your local community. Collections are large and small, with different priorities and methods of collecting. I will not be taking you through a 20-minute guide to the joys and wonders of local studies this afternoon. That will have to wait for another time. My talk today will focus on including representative recent content in local studies collections. And I fear I am, treading in a path trod by others this afternoon, which is actually a good thing. Because if your collection is only telling part of the story of your community, it's biased. And look, realistically, all collections are biased. But a critical difference is, do you care that some people, places, and stories are rendered invisible by local studies collections decisions in the past and even the present? And what actions are you going to take? I do not think that inaction is a helpful option. Now, this slide is for people who like to know where presentations are going. Now, I'm including some examples of recent content in New South Wales public libraries as part of the presentation. Any uncredited photographs are taken by public library services staff, including myself. This shows the cover of one of the books produced out of the Black Summer bushfires. This one is in the local studies collection at Eurobodalla Libraries and has oral histories associated with it. But so that we're all thinking about the same thing, here is a definition for local studies. I'm just going to change the screen slightly. And I would actually add that I think it's informed representative collecting, as you can't collect everything. And I like the term local studies, not local history, because it makes it clearer that economy, geography, community celebrations, for example, are more likely to be included. Plus, it highlights the importance of recent content. And recent content is what I'm focusing on today. I think this definition from 1991 is still solid. Now, I've put this here as social justice is a key element to consider for local studies collections. And actually, the new ALIA principles for multicultural collections and services, just out, state that library and information services ensure that members of multicultural communities feel welcomed and connected and see themselves represented in collections, services, and workforce. And these include local studies collections. Well, now, while this is not a local studies collection, it represents local studies information, and it's in the veranda area at Wentworth Library in southwestern New South Wales. What is held in the local studies collection in each public library is different, as befits each area having different stories. Each library has different staffing, different budgets, different priorities, and the size and formats of local studies collections vary from library to library. Now, what doesn't vary is that no other library is going to be as committed to local stories as public libraries should be, regardless of the size or the location, because they will be closest to these stories, provided people take time to notice them, to notice change, and potentially to undertake some documenting of change. This is one example of a local study space in Springwood in the Blue Mountains. This is in Singleton in the Hunter Valley, and another style in Tumbarumba further south. Now, I want to focus on two sets of research just at a top level though. And I'm yet to go all the way through the data for the New South Wales Public Library Local Studies Survey, which closed in May. I'm showing you some of the results. We've actually undertaken this survey at approximately 5-year intervals, with the previous survey being undertaken in 2020. As a background, New South Wales has 90 public library services and 128 councils. This is by Sophia, aged 5, and shows what her street looks like in 2024. This is in the City of Canada Bay Local Studies collection and is part of a set of drawings by children. And there's another set from 1991 as well. Ham, an archivist, takes a blunt approach towards collecting, but I like the term informed selection. And this bluntness from Ham is helpful as it challenges collecting organisations to look at what and why they're collecting. And the comment about accidental collecting connects to my findings and also the survey results, which I'll get to soon. And it makes the point that collecting organisations need to do our jobs well, being deliberate about what we do and not fragmented and uncoordinated or even accidental about local studies. And Shorten and Srinivasan remind us that for everything preserved, there is likely to be something lost. And this is a stark reminder that your library is unable to be able to collect and care for everything. And your choices matter, and your choices can influence who is remembered in your community. So for everything added to your collection, something else can't be. This is part of the Hornsby Local Studies collection showing a local supermarket. Now, the library I researched using ethnography rarely said no to unsolicited donations. They used relational decision-making and were at risk of collecting from cliques. Now, the first point means that those who know they can donate do. Now, this might sound obvious. However, there are issues of privilege with this, both with knowing you can donate, feeling sure that the information from you, your business, your family has value compared to other people who may not know they can donate, may not feel the same way that their information has value about their family, their business or community, or that it has a right to be in the local studies collection. Also, not everyone has items or objects to donate. Maybe the donors have things because their families are rich. They've lived in the area for a long time. They stole things. There are lots of potential reasons, but this was not the focus of my research. And all of this can contribute to collection bias because of who has stuff and gives it to the library. And keep in mind, and this is actually the critical point, it's mostly unsolicited donations, so that the collecting is driven potentially by the donors and not the library collection plan. People offer your library information about the area, and as a library, you rarely say no because you don't want to lose it. But it means that you're collecting part of the story of your area about privilege and potentially entitlement, but not a nuanced and complex account of your area. And it is unlikely to be representing everyone in your community. Saying yes to some unsolicited donations is likely to be a good call. Saying yes to all of them is probably not, as it's unlikely to be informed selecting. Now, these show some of the survey results from the local studies survey, and just as my research found that unsolicited donations were the main method, look at the top here, the same is shown. Now, they were described as donations which were offered because I was using more positive language, but they are unsolicited donations. And this really can impact the representation of your community, because what if your library only has relationships with people who have a specific kind of accent, or who all went to one school, where there's more than one school in the area, or who all have the same skin tone or political view? This means you're only collecting about this aspect and potentially amplifying their influence and lasting impact when other people have been made to appear as if they're invisible. Now, accepting unsolicited donations is a choice, and this is choosing to privilege the stories of those who have items to donate. And this may be okay, although I have a lot of reservations about it. But because it makes a difference if your library is also using other methods to develop the local studies collections, such as purchasing items, but not everything has a published story. Options such as photography and oral history and other created content can also be important to collecting. However, the top option is still unsolicited donations. This shows a commissioned photograph, and it is the Jingli Lion Dancing Group in the Fairfield City Council area and is part of the Fairfield City Heritage Collection. This was one of the questions asked in the local studies survey earlier this year. This is New South Wales data only, and I have no idea if it looks different in other states and territories. What's interesting to me is there's almost an identical number of libraries who collect born digital content for local studies collections as those who don't. And it seems unusual that because if in 2025 a library is not collecting digital original content as part of their local studies collection, they are likely to be missing out key information about their local community. This photograph from 2023 shows the Granny Smith Festival parade in the city of Ryde, and yet, yes, it is a celebration of the apples. In the survey, along with over 80 other questions, there were some specific questions about recent content. And this was the first time they'd been asked in this survey. And this was to see if libraries were collecting about specific events, as this might make it easier for libraries to describe their collecting. Now, I've clustered these three together because they're all about 5 years ago, and the numbers are quite small, and they are three things which were mostly unevenly distributed across New South Wales. As a note, the drought, which included 2018 and 2019, was for many parts of New South Wales the worst drought on record by a long way, leading to large numbers of livestock being sold amongst other impacts. And there are 3 public libraries who have anything about it in their local studies collection. And perhaps this shows the impact of drought because of how people think about things. Drought can be a time of kind of slow and relentless change rather than something that fast and dramatic. Would need more research to explore this. Bushfires, we see additional collecting methods such as photographs and oral histories, and there were a range of grants to help with this. Mouse plagues are a different kind of unpleasant, and yet they, along with drought and bushfires, have a big economic impact, and yet only one library collected information about this, despite several libraries directly being impacted by the mouse plague. So I'm curious about that one. This shows a photograph from Blue Mountain's local studies collection documenting the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these additional topics show the impact of more recent things, and it could be that some libraries took the opportunity to document the pandemic when people really were experiencing lockdowns in different ways. And I think it's really good to see that at least one library included their library action plan as part of the local studies collection. This has shown kind of like an increase in the number of libraries doing things, but it still needs further analysis because I've already found that checking library catalogues does not always result in finding things. This is a photograph from March 2022 showing floods in the Hawkesbury area, and this is part of the Hawkesbury Library Service collection. The photograph on the left shows Bega Library undertaking an oral history interview after the Black Summer bushfires, and you can see some of the immediate destruction behind them. And the one on the right is from Goulburn Mulwari. They were raising awareness about their oral history program, and both photographs are used with permission of their libraries. I think the collecting opportunities are there, and they can be simple, but they must be deliberate so that we're making an informed selection of information that will provide the future with a representative record of human experience of our area and our time, to slightly modify the quote from Ham. A few photographs of local streets, festivals, floods and droughts. Even a handful each year over time will add up and add to the documenting of our area. It sounds a low bar, and it is, but for the around 50% of New South Wales public libraries not undertaking any digital collecting, even a little and collecting regularly, providing an approach of informed selection rather than unsolicited donation is used, is likely to make a helpful difference. Oral histories are amazing, and maybe there are groups that can be partnered with this. Just going to skip through that. Now, 3 things to think about. This is really what I want people to go away and think about, although I'm not quite at the end yet. Because when a local studies collection does not represent the whole community, it is collecting and preserving a biased account of that community. Now, the bias might start out as unintentional or unconscious, but it's still there, and the outcome is not reflective of community diversity. The heading on this slide is inspired by Dr. Alexandra Alexandra Delios and her recent book, Heritage Making and Migrant Subjects in the Deindustrialising Region of the Latrobe Valley. In this book, Dr. Delios looks at how the stories of culturally and linguistically diverse people are recorded, specifically industrial areas which may no longer be industrial, like the Latrobe Valley, and where workers have moved away. And this is what local studies could be about, including social justice and privileging ordinary storytelling, as the stories of the ordinary have their importance. This actually shows a photograph not from a public library, but from the State Library of New South Wales by Darren Clark, showing Papasut Wutanka and Millie Huang filling a 1-ton bag of rice at the Sunrise Mill in Deniliquin in April 2024. And documenting stories like this look like privileging ordinary storytelling. And whose stories collect help show the value of a community, and seasonal workers have value. And you can see another example in the next slide. And this is seasonal worker Olvi Deborah, also working in Deniliquin in April 2024. Now, there was a reference to mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors earlier, but really, why does representation matter? Why do we care about it? Other than the fact of these people are in our communities and we should want them included in our local studies collection. Now, this metaphor was written about by Dr. Rudine Sims-Bishop and came because of research by several people, including her, into children's collections in the US, into how likely children who were not white to see them would be to see themselves reflected in stories they were reading. Now, the answer in the late 1980s and early 1990s was not very likely, and the data still isn't great. I think there's relevance to considering this concept for local studies, to ask how representative are local studies collections, and how well do these collections reflect, mirror, and provide windows for the community? Whose stories are visible and whose are ignored? Windows reflect stories like yours back to you. Windows let you see into other stories, and sliding glass doors allow you to step into other experiences. So mostly accepting unsolicited donations and not considering demographic information is more likely to lead to a mirror ball effect than a series of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And so this leads to questions of how can local studies collections assist in amplifying voices and histories which may have been silenced. So whether the lack of collecting in some areas was or is accidental exclusion or deliberate exclusion, the outcome is the same. Stories are not collected and people are excluded. And really, once you're aware of the gaps, if you're not taking action to change, that becomes deliberate exclusion and deliberate and active bias. Do you really want your local studies collection only telling part of the story of your community in a lot of detail? So back to a question from the survey. So this was asking, how does local demographic data influence local studies collecting? Now, I've yet to undertake a full analysis of this and, frankly, most of the questions. However, for quite a few public libraries, the demographic data had no influence. And this actually seems a problem to me, particularly as early data shows the main method of acquiring materials for local studies collections is unsolicited donations. This seems to have a few assumptions in the mix, that everyone knows they can donate to the library, that everyone has things to donate, and that everyone wants to donate. Now, I realise it's complicated to consider the demographic data, especially for the many public libraries who do not have designated staff or allocated staff time for local studies, so that staff have to fit around everything they're doing. And I think that ideas from Dr. Nicole's new competent humility model, she has a book coming out on this and has done a video on it, and Denver Public Library's diversity audit of local studies collections can help. Multiple narratives are to be encouraged, not so we're providing a mirror ball effect, but so that we're not providing a single story. And note, this is not miss, or disinformation, rather different experiences of the same event. These photographs were taken at Liverpool Museum in Western Sydney during an exhibition last year called Exilio. And it's about people who migrated to Australia from Chile as a result of the 1973 coup, which brought Augusto Pinochet to power. It describes their different experiences of leaving Chile, and they left because their lives were threatened or the lives of family members were threatened. And it includes also their experiences of living in Western Sydney. These were filmed oral histories, mostly in Spanish, to document their experiences. There were subtitles for the purpose of the exhibition. And this links to points raised by Jane earlier this afternoon. But it also asks questions, are many different perspectives available in your local studies collections, or are few reflected in many ways? It's important to make sure we are including the stories and information by and with First Nations people, women, younger people, people who live with disability, people who are culturally and linguistically diverse, who are economically disadvantaged, and more. We want them included in our local studies collections. And because you can't collect everything, taking an informed representative approach is more likely to actually represent your community rather than mostly accepting unsolicited donations, which is more likely to demonstrate the privilege of those who have them to donate. Again, it's not an either or, but rather a both approach. And so the key is to plan and take action. It could be a diversity audit. It could also be as simple as when you're walking down the streets of your area, do you know who's not visible in your local studies collection? And also with the action, while I'm a fan of planning, I'd also say don't overthink it. It can be as simple as photographs. I was taking photographs in the form of slides in the late 1990s to document change in the local government area I worked in. It's not a new idea, and frankly, it's a lot easier with digital photography. And you might already have other council staff taking photographs. A sample of these could be catalogued and added to the library management system. You can plan for oral histories. Consider having them bilingual and working with the community on these, where people speak languages in addition to English. And really, they don't need to be translated into English. I had some citations. I have some citations which I can send out if anyone is interested. And this image is thanks to Burwood Local Heritage Collection, showing a Burwood street party celebrating 150 years of the council. This is actually part of hundreds of commissioned photographs by the council for this anniversary. So, where to now? In a few months, hopefully, I'll have the report about the 2025 New South Wales Local Studies Survey available online. And it will help to show the shape of public library local studies collections in New South Wales, which, as you can see from the samples I've been showing, are amazing, wonderful, and surprising. And we may not be able to fix collecting practices from the past, but with recent and contemporary collecting, including content creation, we can help reflect the current community so that it is well documented for the future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Really, really interesting. We already have one question from Philip Hyder. He said, he notes that you mentioned partnerships. He's wondering if librarians are linking up or could link up with various community groups to help source a wider range of stories and material. And if so, could you suggest any that might be particularly helpful?
I think it's really, so far, it's more a series of small scale collaborations. And realistically, you're not going to get very far without partnerships because you need both the entry into a whole range of different communities and you need credibility. But, you know, the local studies meeting earlier this year was held at Liverpool Library. They had an exhibition from Liverpool Women's Health Centre. That was done in collaboration. The Liverpool Women's Health Centre items are now going to be going to the Liverpool Library Local Studies Collection. That actually includes information about culturally and linguistically diverse health promotions and health services in the area. I think it's really an area that much more still needs to be done. It's an area where there's a small number of examples, but no one's doing lots. Because it's always, all local studies is challenging. And so that's why I do get why accepting unsolicited donations can seem a good pathway. They come to you, but they don't come to you equally or with equity. And it is too easy to silence. So I think it's about making friends in a whole range of communities, making friends in a professional context, not in anything that's going to break your code of conduct. And building them, showing credibility over time. And by having collections in languages in your library, that may bring people in and you can start the conversation around, oh, we'd love to record an oral history with you, but we don't speak the right languages. So working with training. So it's very much still very much a work in progress rather than anyone's got it perfectly sorted. Although if someone's got it perfectly sorted, please let me know. But I haven't come across examples like that. It's more that a range of libraries are doing one or two things, but one or two things can make a difference over time.
Yeah, interesting. Any other questions for Ellen? I did wonder a little bit about sort of the relationship between, you know, what we think of as libraries and archives in this context, and particularly around the sort of professional skills associated with those. I mean, is that anything you think, is there a need for more archivists in the public library sector to sort of to bring their expertise to bear on in some of these collections?
Oh, look, it'd be lovely, but how they'd be funded would be the challenge, I think. There are certainly people who are qualified archivists working in particularly in bigger public libraries. But the challenge also exists in small public libraries where you literally have no designated time, and it's fitted around everything else that you're doing, which is why I think even a simple start actually will give you something positive in the future. But yes, there are libraries with quite extensive archival collections. And so yes, there would be the place for additional archivists, but on another level, just getting some more qualified librarians into the would also be a real, not just getting more qualified librarians into some of the spaces would also be very helpful as well. But it's how do you pay for them?
Yeah, of course. Always the question. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you to all of our speakers, to Jane and Anne as well. It's been a really interesting session. I'm going to stop the recording now. And